I want to take or rather, hear your insights before we move to Europe. I'd like to have your inputs about the recent visit of the Russian president to North Korea and Vietnam. I take specific interest in Vietnam. Of course, the North Korea, I'm very familiar. I've been following the relations between the two countries for 3 or 4 last decades or so. The one in Vietnam, I am very, very interested in hearing your take on it. And correct me if I'm wrong, Carl. Is this has to do with reestablishment of old alliances?
So Vietnam and North Korea, they have a traditional tie with Russia that dates all the way back to Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union supported both Vietnam and Korea in the War of Liberation against Americans. During Korean War, the Soviet Air Force actually sent in their own pilots to fight over the sky in North Korea in the secret air war. They would paint the MiG planes in the Chinese colors, and the Soviet pilots will dress in the Chinese uniform, and then they will join the air war. There's an area around the Yalu River that was called MiG Valley. That's where a lot of the Soviet planes, Air Force operated. And the Soviet Air Force also playing a pivotal role in training the first generation of the Chinese Air Force who participated in the Korean War. And in Vietnam War as well, Soviet Union provided a lot of the materials to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, or in Vietnam, what they call the American War. And that relationship never stopped. One of the reasons North Korea had a difficult time after the collapse of Soviet Union is because their economy has been integrated with the Soviet bloc. And when the Soviet economy collapsed, that's when North Korea was not getting enough fuel for its tractors, for its farm equipment, and it's not able to buy grain. And this is why North Korea had that famine in the early 90s. This is basically a result of the Soviet collapse. And Vietnam, they source most of their military equipment from Soviet Union and then Russia. So for example, okay, but let me do one country at a time. So North Korea, they had an interest to continually work with Russia because for decades, North Korea was placing under intense sanction by United States through UN, and they call North Korea the hermit kingdom, like North Korea wants to close itself off. No, North Korea is being closed off because of your sanctions, and so North Korea has an interest to break through that isolation. And when Russia itself has been placing under sanction, there's nothing to stop Russia and North Korea to carry on a normal relationship. And North Korea also has large stockpiles of conventional artillery shells, which is much needed on the battlefield of Ukraine right now. We all know the problem of United States to produce enough artillery shell, 155 millimeter artillery shells for Ukraine in this war, because U.S. have deindustrialized. But North Korea still maintain an industry and they still have a large stockpile of artillery shells and missiles they could send to Russia, and that happened after the Putin visit. And so these two have a traditional friendship, but they also have the current geopolitical reality also make the two work together. Now Vietnam, they always maintain their friendly tie with Soviet Union. And in fact, the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War happened because Vietnam decided to choose Soviet Union after the Sino-Soviet split. Yeah, because through Sino-Soviet split happened relatively early on in like late 50s, early 60s. But throughout 1960s, both China and Soviet Union supported Vietnam in its war against Americans. but after Vietnam after the liberation of Saigon in 1975, and that's a point when Vietnam had to face a choice. They have to choose between China or Soviet Union in the aftermath of Sino-Soviet split. Vietnam made the decision to go with Soviet Union because Soviet Union in 1975 just was much bigger power. It could provide much more material support, and that led to the deterioration of ties between China and Vietnam. That's eventually led to the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War. But Vietnam never, their tie with Soviet Union only became stronger after that. In 1979, just before the Sino-Vietnamese War, actually, Vietnam signed a mutual defense treaty with Soviet Union. So what that means is Vietnam's weapon systems, they all come from Soviet Union. And later, Russia, they come from Russia. Now, this is important because, and United States understands this. This is why U.S. is always trying to push to sell some weapon system, not only to further the interest of U.S. military-industrial complex, but once you sell weapon to a country, you tie the country's security elite to your own interest. Because when United States sell weapons to South American country, for example, then these South American countries have to send their officers, their personnel to United States to train, to learn how to operate this equipment. And this relationship builds up over time. And this is how U.S. gets its fingers in all around the globe. And so Vietnam, they still, because its own industry is not at the point where it could satisfy its own security needs. So you need to buy weapons from elsewhere. And it has stuck with the Russian-made weapons. And this also reinforced its ties with Russia. This security needs. The U.S. is also trying to push its own weapons with Vietnam, but Vietnam already have a traditional supplier. It's very expensive to maintain multiple weapon platform. Because the NATO platform and the old Soviet platform, they don't. It's a lot more. You have to basically maintain. You pay double for the maintenance. It's a lot easier to stick with one system. So Vietnam decided to stick with the Russian weapon system, which has shown its effectiveness in the Ukraine war, and I think that will continue. And this also allowed Vietnam a certain degree of independence, because United States is trying to loop Vietnam on its bandwagon to contain China, but that's not going to work because, again, Vietnam's economy is very much tightly cooped with China, and Vietnam's economics, its political structure is also very similar to China. I lived in Southern California in Huntington Beach for a while. I still see United States still have those Vietnamese broadcasts, into Vietnam about to foster regime change, to overthrow the Vietnamese government and all that, because Vietnam's communist. So in the meantime, United States also want Vietnam to help it to contain China. So Vietnam's like, okay, why do I need to be your palm, your foot soldier? We can just continue to do business with China, and in the meantime, Vietnam's security need can be met with its relationship with Russia by sourcing those, continue to source with Russian weapons. So this is what Putin's visit does: is to reinforce the traditional ties and the existing ties with these two countries.
Yeah. Well, certainly the West didn't like this, because I just read the statement by the European chief foreign policy, the idiot Borrell, the garden guy. That was now Europe is concerned about, in this case, Tunisia's relations with China, Russia, and Iran. So what the heck? Why would you care for that? So I see your point about Vietnam and the Russian president's visit, because to me was the Russian president's visit to Vietnam was a strategic move. That's to me was a strategic move because Putin in this case want to put the dots on the letter as far as where the trajectory of the global order is headed. That's to me what it meant. And here in the West, of course, Washington got very concerned about this because we wanted to woo Vietnam and Cambodia to a degree because we didn't want to get closer to China economically, but with the Russians militarily.
And for Russian side,
yeah,
Putin is also showing the world Russia is back as a world power. Like they done that first with the Russian intervention in the Syrian war in 2015, because these are all traditional allies of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet, in many cases, when in its confrontation with United States, they always back down. Like Soviet back down in the Cuban Missile Crisis and many other instances. But Putin is saying, we're not backing down this time. You are sending jihadists into Syria to unseat Assad. I'm going to send the Russian Air Force in, and there are also traditional spheres of the part of the influence of the Soviet bloc. After the American withdrew after Vietnam War, Soviet maintained its naval base. The Soviet Pacific Fleet actually they inherited the U.S. naval base in Cam Ranh Bay, and so Putin is showing the world, hey, we're back. The Russians are back. The Russians are back in Syria. Russians back in Vietnam. Russians are back in Korea. Now it's a multipolar world, and Russia is one of those poles.
Yeah. Indeed. Let's pivot to Europe, Carl, if I may. I'd like to get your take about, first of all, we start with the tariff, the European tariff on Chinese EVs, 40%. The tariffs on the US, 100%. The tariffs on the Turks that they issued on Chinese for 38%. Then you have the visit of the economic minister of Germany, the idiot Barak, Robert Barak, whatever his name is, going to China begging for help. What is these double standards? What do you make out of all this?
Europe right now is a many-headed beast, right? I mean, EU bureaucracy. You have people like von der Leyen, you have Borrell, but then you have these national government. They're trying to at least do something for their own business. And German business is very much dependent on the Chinese market today. China has the world's largest market for automobiles, and that's where a lot of the German automaker make their Deutschmark is in China. But they are facing intense competition from the rolling out of Chinese EV, because the German traditional automakers, they kind of missed the boat on the EV. They didn't put a lot of energy. They didn't really have their heart in it. And when they saw this wider adoption of EV in China, it's not only eaten into the profit of the German company in China, but now it threatens their home market. And this is where they kind of find themselves aligned with United States on the EV tariff. But the company that get most affected is Tesla, because Tesla make a lot of its EVs in Shanghai Gigafactory, and those are being exported around the world. And when people read this about Chinese EV flooding the world, what they don't realize, a lot of the export numbers, Tesla, the export is making up for the majority of the number. It's those Tesla that are exporting from Shanghai. So Tesla buyers in Germany, in Europe, in US, they're going to see a price hike, because thanks to Uncle Sam and their European politicians with this, because the Chinese automakers, their primary fight is still for the market share within China. They're exporting, but their export number is still small compared to their production number in China. They're mainly focusing in displacing the traditional internal combustion engine cars in China right now. I think China now is almost the new car sale in China is almost 50% is in electric cars. So this is one area the German automakers are suffering, because a lot of their production capability in China are still making in old IC cars, and when they can't sell enough in China, they have to export. So a lot of the export driven by the EV adoption in China is actually led by a lot of the foreign joint ventures, including the German automakers, because they have to sell back. At least this is where they don't have to compete with Tesla being exported from China when there's a tariff on Tesla coming out of China, so they can still export their traditional ICE cars from China back to Europe. This is how the game is played about with the German automakers. But they're fighting. The time is not on their side. I mean, the way forward is for themselves to adopt the innovation in the EV industry and to revitalize manufacturing and research and development in Germany. But that's not happening because guess what? They're cutting themselves from Russian gas, one of the cheap energy source that Europe depends on. They just recently slapped on another for the first time. Before they left the Russian gas alone, but recently they did a first sanction on Russian LNG re-export through Europe. Even though it's a symbolic move, it's only affect about $2 billion of trade. But this is starting a really bad precedent. I mean, Russia is already reoriented its gas export away from Europe to China. They're building the Power of Siberia 2 to China. And the current Russian gas export to China is through Power of Siberia 1, which takes the natural gas in central Siberia, pipe them to China, the closest market. But Power of Siberia 2, the gas field they're building it from is a Yamal gas field in the Russian Arctic, which normally would have piped the gas through Nord Stream to Germany. With the Nord Stream shutting down, now the Russians are doubling the effort to build the complete Power Siberia 2. So all that gas field in the Arctic, in the Yamal Peninsula, once the Power of Siberia 2 complete, it's going to cut across all the way through Siberia and pipe into China, and no more gas for Europe. And so time is not on the European side if they want to, they want to get on with growing with their economy. But now the problem is we have people like von der Leyen, who her actual re-election slogan is actually, I am about security. I'm about the European security. And she goes to visit like a World War II bunker, like a nuclear bunker in Finland. And this is ridiculous, man. This is she has to do this to show Washington, hey, I'm your woman, I'm your spokeswoman. I can be relied upon. Please make me the next the leader for another term. But this is not good for Europe. It's not good for the interest of the either European business community or the European consumers.
I got a word a few months ago, Carl, that she was hoping for the position of the Secretary General for NATO. And I was like just shaking my head. She was even elected for that position. And now with the elections in Europe, we can see where things are going. As a matter of fact, there's a big concern right now in France with the far right that's going to end up taking over. So, and rightly so. So just to go back to your point about the gas, I do remember I allocated a section in my book, in my Russia book, about exactly what you talked about, the transfer of gas. And I argued in it back then that Russia doesn't have to worry about the Western market anymore. It just suffices to ship everything to Asia, because Asia is becoming the central hub for the global economy, whether the West likes it or not. And turns out to be accurate, because that's where Russia is moving into that direction. So now, one last thing I want to get your take on before I'll open it for some questions here. I do know the Indian Prime Minister Modi is going to visit Russia soon. Of course, with the dismal results of the elections, what would you make out of that trip? Why the heck would he be going to Russia for?
Modi, he has to. Well, India is playing this kind of the middleman, right?
Ah,
He's 1 foot in the BRICS and 1 foot in with alignment with the Western camp. So right now he's putting his left foot forward in Russia, because India and Russia has a traditional relationship dates all the way back to with Soviet Union.
that's true.
In the Cold War, India was closely aligned with the Soviet Union, and again, India also, it's just like Vietnam. Its own India's own industry cannot fulfill its security needs. So India has to
Yeah,
source its weapons elsewhere, and its largest source for weapon platform remains Russia. India spends
that's true.
billions of dollars importing Russian weapon uniform. This is one of the kind of the bedrock of India Russia relationship. And
Relations.
this is something not even Washington can sabotage. I mean, I'm sure Washington wants India to make more purchase of Western art like NATO weapon platforms, but India already have this reliable suppliers in Russia. You will buy some Western weapons, but you will not make a switch like what United States want
Yeah.
to. And
Yeah.
and Modi also want to probably want to shore up his international standing. Especially as you mentioned, his lackluster election results at home. He by going abroad, meeting with world leader like Putin, he's also shoring up his image domestically. It's like, hey, look,
Yeah.
Putin is meeting me. He's recognizing me as a legitimate leader of India. They're welcoming us in Moscow, right? So it looks good for newspapers back home. So
Yeah.
this is another reason. But India is never gonna like. United States actually gave a lot of leeway to India on its relationship with Russia, both in terms of energy, because India also sourced a lot of oil and gas from Russia,
Hmm.
especially after the sanction. And it's because Washington still need India to contain China, so Washington is willing to cut India some slack, but it's also putting a lot of pressure. We're seeing like the whole Canada India diplomatic role
Yeah.
over the assassination of Canadian
Yeah.
citizens in Canada, and then we have you're gonna see more. This is just my educated guess. In the coming weeks, when Modi goes to Russia, you're gonna see more articles in Western press about criticizing India about human rights records, or different ways to criticize India, which is not hard to do, but you're going to see more of that in the Western press. I mean, that has been a trend in the last few years.
Yeah. Well, of course, when we threatened to sanction India back in 2018 for buying oil from Iran, because after we pulled out of the GCPOA, and at that time Modi had to bow to the U.S. pressure. So to me, the always concern about India is really its people, and I know people inside India as of today. I do know, and they tell me the conditions how they are. Unemployment is rampant in India. So you ask yourself, what did this Modi? What has he done for the country for the last 14 years?